Beneath the crown, behind the throne, and buried deep in the royal archives lies a side of medieval England they definitely didn't teach you in history class. This is not a tale of battles and borders. This is 53 strange, surreal, and wonderfully twisted stories about monarchs who lost their jewels in quicksand, fed wine to elephants, and hired professional flatulists for Christmas. Welcome to a kingdom where weird wasn't the exception. It was the rule. Buckle up your velvet doublet. Things are about to get bizarre. Before we dive headfirst into royal oddities and medieval mayhem, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss a single tale from the shadowy corners of history. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it as you press play? Midnight in Manchester, sunrise in Sydney. We want to know who's wandering into the weeds with us. Number 1, King Canute and the Tide is 1020s. In the grand hall of flattery and gold-leafed lies, there once sat a king who'd had enough. King Canute the Great, ruler of England, Denmark, and Norway, wearer of crowns stacked like pancakes, was done listening to his courtiers suck up to him like he was a Norse demigod. So he decided to prove a point the medieval way with a dramatic stunt involving the sea. He marched his royal entourage to the edge of the tide, throne and all, and issued an order that would make a lesser man tremble with theological guilt. Stop, waves. And then, while his nobles squirmed in their velvet boots, he sat and waited. The sea, famously disrespectful to human ego, did what seas do best. It rose. The waves lapped at his feet, then his robes, and finally his throne, until the king himself was wet, cold, and gloriously vindicated. Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, he supposedly declared, drenched in salty irony. There is none worthy of the name but God. Of course, this wasn't humility as much as it was performance art. Canute wasn't trying to stop the sea. He was stopping the sycophants. His throne wasn't a seat of power. It was a sarcastic beach chair. And yet, this soaked little fable survived centuries because it tapped into something sticky. The hilarious futility of human authority in the face of nature's endless disinterest. Whether the story's true or embroidered like an old banner, its message survived. Even kings can't order the tide to chill out. And yet, while Canaan was schooling his nobles in divine boundaries, his spiritual successor, Edward the Confessor, was allegedly pulling off miracles of his own. Except this next one involves a mysterious ring, a holy beggar, and a prophecy mailed in from the Holy Land. Number 2, Edward the Confessor's Miracle Ring. Edward the Confessor had the look of a man halfway to sainthood and the personality of someone who preferred incense to politics. Pious, pale, and problematically passive. He spent most of his reign as England's monarch, trying to avoid doing much actual monarching, which is possibly how he ended up giving his ring to a beggar who turned out to be St. John the Evangelist in disguise. Yes, that St. John. Apparently, Edward, walking the holy tightrope of medieval PR, was approached by a ragged old man asking for alms. Instead of reaching for coins or pretending not to see him, the classic royal response, Edward slipped off his ring and handed it over. No questions, no drama. Just here, take this extremely sacred symbol of my divine right to rule. Years passed. The ring was gone. The beggar disappeared. Edward went back to looking politely miserable during councils. Then a group of English pilgrims returning from the Holy Land showed up with something unsettling. Edward's ring. According to them, a mysterious old man had given it to them, saying it belonged to Edward, King of England. And oh, by the way, he'd see Edward in heaven in 6 months. The king naturally did what any medieval ruler would do upon receiving a ghost ring with a death notice. He quietly began preparing for the afterlife. Sure enough, 6 months later, Edward died just as predicted. The legend turned him into a saint and the ring into a relic, a holy PR stunt that aged into canon. Whether it was divine prophecy or just excellent coordination by the medieval church's storytelling department, Edward's miracle ring became a cornerstone of his sanctity and a reminder that in England, even jewelry has a death forecast. But while Edward was brushing elbows with saints, one of his successors would be mired in a more earthly scandal where royal legitimacy turned into village gossip and the throne might have rested on the son of a cobbler. And just like that, a saint's ring turns into a royal prophecy. Medieval England didn't do subtle things. By the way, if you're enjoying this descent into royal weirdness, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And while you're here, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time is it right now. Are you in bed at 2 a.m. or stuck at work pretending to be productive? We see you. Number 3. Harold Harefoot's Question Parentage 1030s. In a century full of swords, saints, and succession crises, Harold Harefoot's greatest weapon was allegedly being good at running. They called him Harefoot for his speed, not his lineage, which, as it turns out, was a bit of a question mark. He ruled as King of England for a few short, chaotic years, but medieval rumor had a sharp little barb to it. What if Harold wasn't even a royal? The whispers were deliciously petty. Some said Harold, son of Connaught the Great and Elfgefu of Northampton, wasn't actually Connaught's son at all, but the product of a secret affair between Ilfu and a common cobbler, a literal shoemaker's son who laced his way to the throne. In a society where bloodline meant everything, and God allegedly co-signed your family tree, this was not just an insult. It was nuclear slander. It painted Harold as a royal fraud, a fast-footed usurper who'd raced into power on borrowed shoes. Of course, the people spreading this were mostly monks and supporters of his rival, Haruknut, Cut's son, by his other, more canonically acceptable wife, Queen Emma. It's worth noting that the same chroniclers accusing Harold of being a cobbler's kid also conveniently thought Hartnut was the second coming with a better bloodline. Still, the rumor stuck. Even centuries later, historians would smirk at the idea that the King of England might have been born in a backroom next to a pile of leather scraps. And if that weren't medieval enough, wait until you hear how the so-called legit son met his end. Forget noble death in battle. Forget royal illness. Harthnut's final act came courtesy of a wedding party, a full belly, and one fatal toast. Number 4. Harth's fatal toast. 1042. Royal deaths are supposed to be grand, climactic, preferably tragic in a poetic sort of way, like falling in battle or perishing heroically to defend a crumbling realm. Harth, however, died at a wedding. More specifically, during a toast. The only thing he defended was his drinking reputation. It was June 8, 1042. The son of Cut the Great and Emma of Normandy, technically more legitimate than his half-brother, Harold Harefoot, if you're counting royal spreadsheets, was attending a wedding feast in Lambeth. Spirits were high. The ale flowed freely. Harthcanute, never one to be outdone in matters of festivity, lifted his goblet to toast the bride and groom. Then without warning, he collapsed straight to the floor, dead within moments. The chroniclers, who never missed a chance to moralize, made it sound like a medieval PSA. Drink responsibly or else. Some hinted at poisoning, others at a sudden stroke, but most settled on death by overindulgence, a narrative that was both juicy and conveniently symbolic. It's unclear whether he died from too much wine, too much food, or too much bad luck, but the result was the same. England's king expired mid-term, leaving behind an empty throne and a generation of gossip. It wasn't just the death, it was the setting. A royal demise in the middle of a wedding reception. It's the kind of absurdly timed exit that sounds like dark comedy or a Shakespeare scene rewritten by Monty Python. The toasts turned to whispers. The laughter froze. The crown slipped quietly into crisis mode. With Harth gone, the throne passed to Edward the Confessor, the saintly king with the prophetic ring, who must have looked at the mess and thought, well, that escalated quickly. But England wasn't done with awkward royal moments. Not by a long shot, because next came a funeral so botched, so profoundly uncomfortable that the body of the king himself didn't fit the coffin. Number 5. William the Conqueror's awkward funeral. 1087, William the Conqueror lived like a thunderclap and died like a cautionary tale. After crushing England at the Battle of Hastings, building castles like Lego sets, and kicking off centuries of Norman rule, the mighty king finally met his end in 1087, thanks somewhat ignorably to a saddle injury and an infected wound. But if death humbled him, his funeral obliterated any lingering dignity. It began with looting. As William's bloated corpse lay cooling in ruin, the nobles around him scrambled, not to mourn, but to rob him blind. Gold, weapons, ceremonial gear, gone. The court, sensing an opportunity, dispersed like rats, leaving a gilded ship. Eventually, someone remembered the whole bury the king thing and cobbled together a plan to transport the body to Caen, where William had commissioned a lovely abbey. That's where things got worse. First, the body took too long to arrive. Then, on the day of the funeral, a fire broke out in town, a literal omen in smoke and ash. But the real disaster was waiting at the altar. When the monks tried to place William into the stone sarcophagus, they discovered an unfortunate oversight. The coffin was too small. Much too small. The solution? Force it. What happened next is usually told with the grimacing language of medieval chroniclers who were simultaneously horrified and unable to look away. Let's just say there were audible consequences. The crowd reeled. The smell lingered. It was in the most literal and metaphorical sense a bursting of royal pomp. William's grand legacy, the conqueror, the reformer, the iron-fisted king, ended in a darkly comic blooper. For all his might, he couldn't escape the final indignity of poor planning and overconfidence in measurements. But perhaps his son, William II, nicknamed Rufus, would learn from his father's demise. Not quite. The younger William went out in the woods by an arrow under a sky of suspicion. Number 6. William II, Rufus, and the New Forest Arrow. 1100, the New Forest wasn't just a royal hunting ground. It was a Norman invention. William the Conqueror had turned it into a personal game park, displacing villages in the process and planting the seeds of myth and misfortune. It's fitting then that his son William II, known as Rufus for his ruddy complexion, would die there in a manner so strange, so shrouded in ambiguity, it remains one of England's eeriest royal deaths. It was August 2, 1100. William was out hunting, as kings did, with a small party that included Walter Tyrrell, a nobleman with a fine aim. At some point during the outing, an arrow struck William in the chest. He died on the spot. No ceremony, no last words, no heraldic trumpets, just a thud in the forest and the unraveling of a rein. Tyrrell, he fled immediately, which in any era looks suspicious. The official story labeled it an accident, an unfortunate mishap during an afternoon sport. But the unofficial stories, the ones passed around a firelight and whispered in monastery halls, told a different tale. Maybe Tyrrell was no clumsy hunter. Maybe it was a planned hit. After all, William's brother, Henry, just happened to be nearby, and he wasted no time claiming the treasury and the crown. Coincidence? Sure. Or choreography? And what of William himself? He wasn't exactly beloved. He'd tangled with the church, squeezed taxes until they squealed, and was famously unmarried and heirless, a king without anchors. Some saw his death as divine punishment, others as political cleanup. But no one forgot how it happened. An arrow, a forest, a fallen king, and a missing shooter. The forest, of course, kept its secrets. Still does. But William's little brother Henry, of the legendary lamprey appetite, would go on to reign longer and tighter than either of his predecessors until one night the dinner table caught up with him. Number 7 Henry were a surfeit of lamper. 1135 By all accounts Henry III was a ruler of calculation known as Henry Burke for his bookish mind. He balanced brutality with bureaucracy and made peace with paper, charters, records, writs. He tightened royal finances, expanded justice, and laid the groundwork for a centralized English monarchy. But for all that shrewdness, he had one fatal flaw, an undying, irrational devotion to lamper. Lampers for the uninitiated are eel-like creatures with circular suction cup mouths lined with teeth. Nature's medieval noodles. They were considered a delicacy in royal circles, especially when spiced and stewed into oblivion. And Henry, he couldn't get enough. Chroniclers say he was warned repeatedly by his physicians to cut back, but advice rarely fares well against obsession, especially culinary ones. In 1135, while staying in Normandy, Henry ignored medical warnings and indulged in a heavy lamprey meal. The aftermath was swift and grim. Within days, the king fell ill and never recovered. The official cause according to contemporary writers was a surfeit of lampers, a courtly euphemism for eating oneself into an early grave. Now could it have been food poisoning, a gastric condition? Maybe. But in the medieval mindset, it was moral shorthand. Even the wisest of kings could be undone by appetite. Henry's death wasn't just a biological failure. It was a fable and a convenient one too, given the disastrous civil war that followed when his chosen heir, Empress Matilda, was challenged by Stephen of Blois. So Henry, who ruled with documents and iron logic, died not in battle or betrayal, but because he couldn't resist the fish equivalent of a medieval guilty pleasure. If power corrupts, lampreys tempt. And with Henry's death, England tumbled into chaos. But Matilda wasn't one to sit around and wait, especially when surrounded by enemies. Which brings us to a snowy night, a white cloak, and one of the greatest jailbreaks in English history. Number 8. Henry II Public Penance. 1174. Powerful kings don't typically kneel for forgiveness, especially not in public, shirtless in the rain. But Henry II wasn't having a typical year. In 1170, his long simmering feud with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, reached a lethal climax. Becket was murdered inside the cathedral by knights who may or may not have interpreted Henry's angry outburst as a royal hide order. Either way, the fallout was biblical. Christendom erupted in scandal. Becket became a martyr overnight. Pilgrims flocked to his tomb, and Henry, the ever-pragmatic statesman, found himself cast not as a king, but as a villain. Worse still, a villain who'd picked a fight with the church. Medieval PR crisis. Absolutely. So, in 1174, Henry did the one thing no one expected. He staged a spiritual spectacle. He crossed the Channel barefoot in the dead of summer, walked to Canterbury Cathedral, and submitted to a ritual whipping by monks. At the shrine of the very man whose death he'd helped cause, he prostrated himself and took the blows, one for each monk present. Some say there were 80. Others say it was symbolic. Either way, the performance was clear. Penance as pageantry. It worked. The gesture helped restore his image, realign him with the church, and place him back on moral footing, literally. And while it didn't erase Becket's death, it transformed Henry's shame into narrative. The king who raged became the king who repented. But of course, not all of Henry's court was so solemn. Amid the gravitas of empire and theology, there was still room for absurdity. Like Roland Le Fouruter, Henry's official flatulist, who earned land and title for a very particular Christmas performance, a jump, a whistle, and one extremely well-timed fart. Number 9. The royal flatulist Henry II court. In a court filled with bishops, barons, and bureaucrats, one man earned his keep with a jump, a whistle, and a fart. His name was Roland Le Fouruter. And yes, that's exactly what he did for a living officially in the records. Roland was what the medieval world called a flatulist, a professional farter. And under Henry II, who ruled with a mix of iron logic and occasional absurdity, Roland became something of a Christmas tradition. Every year during the royal festivities, he would perform his act. One leap into the air, one high-pitched whistle, and one precisely delivered blast from the rear. It was rhythmic. It was ritualistic. It was somehow royal entertainment. But this wasn't just court jester fluff. Roland's performance was so valued that he was granted land for it. A manor in Suffolk to be precise. His service was enshrined in the royal records as a kind of bizarre tenancy agreement. Produce one jump, one whistle, and one fart annually at Christmas, and the estate is yours. In the world of medieval job descriptions, this one stands out like loot at a funeral. Was it satire? Was it slapstick? Or was it perhaps a sly nod to the fact that even kings, no matter how divine their authority, still laughed at the same jokes as the rest of us? What's certain is this. Roland Le Fouruter's legacy outlasted most of his contemporaries. Historians still quote his job title with a mix of disbelief and admiration. Because in a world obsessed with lineage and solemnity, Roland cut through the pomp with the purest form of medieval humor, bodily and unashamed. And speaking of royal oddities, how about a king who barely spoke the language of the country he ruled? England's next big-name warrior king didn't just prefer foreign tongues, he basically ghosted the whole island. Number 10. Richard the Lionheart's language oddity. You'd think that being King of England would come with one baseline requirement, speaking English. But Richard Wes, known forever as Richard the Lionheart, had other priorities like crusading and writing poetry and staying as far from England as humanly possible. Born in Oxford but raised in Aquitaine, Richard grew up speaking French and Occitan, the lyrical languages of truiters, not tax collectors. He was fluent in warfare, diplomacy, and the art of brooding beneath a banner. But English, that was for peasants and parchment pushers. To Richard, England was less a homeland and more a piggy bank, something to tax, pawn, or leave behind while he rode off in chain mail toward Jerusalem. In fact, he spent barely 6 months in England during his entire 10-year reign. That's not a joke or an exaggeration. 6 months. The rest of the time he was crusading, getting captured, raising ransom, and carving his legend into stone walls across Europe and the Holy Land. When he was in England, he communicated through interpreters and documents, rarely engaging with the common tongue. But the English didn't seem to mind. Richard was a celebrity king, a banner rather than a bureaucrat. His image, bold, lion-hearted, Christ-like in armor, was more important than his pronunciation. And yet this linguistic detachment says something revealing that for centuries England's monarchs weren't really English. They were Normans, Angevins, Plantagenets, French in culture, French in tongue, and foreign in instinct. The throne was less a seat of national identity and more a European franchise. But if Richard didn't speak much English, he sure knew how to monetize the crown. In fact, he once sold off so many royal assets to fund his crusades, people began to wonder if he'd list the Tower of London next on eBay.